English Passengers was a difficult book to write, but one that I'm now very pleased I wrote. It took me 7 years altogether. I'd finished a book just before about London in the Victorian times, in the 19th century, about the terrible goings-on in London, and I wanted to write a book about terrible goings-on in the British Empire. And at that time, the British Empire was sort of unfashionable. People really didn't want to think about it. It was as if it was rather like the morning after the party before. Nobody really wanted to remember what had happened those times. I think partly because they missed them, they regretted the country's importance at that time, but also partly because they were embarrassed, ashamed of what had happened. It just didn't connect with their present lives. So there was actually, when I went into a bookshop at that time, there were very few books on the empire. And I decided to write particularly about the empire in Australia, on this island of Tasmania, because I remembered a program I'd seen as a child on the television, which was about the Aboriginals of Australia and how terrible things were, how they were effectively, their culture was totally destroyed, and they were killed by British settlers and convicts. And then, to add insult to injury, afterwards, this became the basis of racial superiority theories among the British. The fact that they destroyed these people who they considered very backward, they regarded as a kind of proof that the British were very superior. So I did tons of research. I started reading about what had happened in Tasmania. I was living in Oxford at the time, so there was a fantastic opportunity in the libraries to find out what had happened. And then I went to Tasmania. I spent a month there. I walked around the mountains. It's a beautiful place, and I studied some more. And then came the awkward thing, which was, what on earth was I going to do with all this research? And that's what really took a long time. I spent about 2 years trying to work out what to do with it, because I had several ideas. I had an Aboriginal character. I wanted to tell the story of what had happened to the Aboriginal people of Tasmania. I had the idea of a nasty British racist imposing his ideas on what had happened, and I also had the idea of, to spice it up, I wanted to have a Manx smuggling ship from the Isle of Man, this little Celtic island which is famously a home for smugglers of brandy and tobacco. And this was where my father came from, so I knew all about it. So in a way you had a very good element. You had the Aboriginals, who were clearly the innocent party in this. You had a nasty racist. Somehow it was too straightforward. I needed something else. I didn't know what I needed, and for about 2 years I was struggling. I would cycle around Oxford getting increasingly annoyed. I just couldn't make sense of it. And I was determined to try and do something with it after all the work I'd done with it. And finally I had 2 radio programs, one after the other, which solved the whole thing. One was about a strange organisation in Britain called the British Israelites, who appeared a bit later in the 19th century. And they were very religious, Anglicans, and they had a problem on their hands, which was they believed intensely in the Bible, they believed intensely in the wonders of Britain, and they couldn't understand why the British weren't mentioned in the Bible. So they came up with a novel idea, which was the British were actually the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So that gave me the idea of a kind of mad religious expedition. And the second idea I heard was, the second program I heard was about a British expedition to Africa with 2 very famous explorers who had completely opposed ideas on religion, politics, you name it. And they very nearly killed each other in an argument over, not politics or religion, but a pillow. And this suddenly unlocked the idea of what an expedition like this would actually be like. So suddenly I could put everything together. I had a religious expedition to find what? I did a bit more research, and I found there was a lot of interest at that time in finding biblical sites, key biblical sites around the world. So this would be to find something the Victorians were desperate to find, which was the real site of the Garden of Eden, led by a vicar, an English vicar, who wants to be basically famous. And by various reasons and accidents, and they would end up on my Manx smuggling ship. And part of the party, one of the party, would be this nasty racist. Suddenly you had an unexpected element, and then I could, suddenly everything was clear. I could understand how I could do this and make it fun. I could understand how I could do this and make it fun. So, and this would be half the story, the other half of the story would be the stories of what actually happened to the Aboriginal people of Australia, of Tasmania. So I was finally able to set to work, and I remember after the long period when I couldn't understand what I'd do with this, waking up each morning just in a state of joy, just so happy that I was finally actually going on with this. And it took me another 3.5 years to write, but those were very happy years. And when I finally produced the thing, I found something quite curious, which was, when it was published, I went back to the same bookshop in Oxford where I had found almost no books on the British Empire, and surprise, surprise, now there were tons of them. So it wasn't just me. A lot of people were becoming interested in the subject at that time.